Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to begin with another witness from the firm which carried out site inspections. So would you ask Mr. Virdee to come in, please?
Can I ask you to read out the witness affirmation, please?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Virdee. Sit down, make yourself comfortable. All right. Yes, Ms. Gregg.
Can you please give the inquiry your full name?
Gurpal Virdee.
Thank you very much for coming to give evidence today and to assist the inquiry with its investigations. I'll be asking you the questions today, and if you have difficulty understanding anything I'm asking you, please do ask me to repeat the question or to put it in a different way.
Sure.
Please also keep your voice up so that the transcribers can hear you. You've made one witness statement for the inquiry, which is in a folder on your desk. Do you have it there?
Yep, I do.
Could I please take you to the first page, which is JRP 50333, so that we can see it?
Sure.
And then the last page, page 15. That's dated 4th of September 2019. Do you see that there?
Yep,
Is that your signature at the bottom?
that is.
Can you confirm that the contents are true?
Yes.
You've also made a statement for the Metropolitan Police. If we could bring that up on the screen, that's MET 3040056. And that's dated 24th of August 2017. Can you confirm that statement is true?
Yes,
And have you read both of your statements recently?
I have.
Have you discussed your evidence with anyone before coming here today?
No.
I'm going to start by asking you some questions about your qualifications and experience. You're currently the managing partner of John Rowan Partners.
I am, yes.
And you've held this role for 3 years since August 2016?
It'll be 4 now, yeah.
Yeah, 4, sorry. My maths. Before that, you were the head of building surveying.
I was.
What did that role entail?
It was a case of managing a team of building surveyors, clerk of works for the business. So I had overall responsibility for that element of the business.
How long did you hold that role?
Oh, good question. 2008-ish.
And what about before that? Were you still at John Rowan Partners?
I was, yes.
And what role did you hold?
So
at that
before
stage?
then, I would have been an associate partner in the same team.
Have you ever worked as a clerk of works yourself?
No.
If we go back to your inquiry statement at JRP 50333, page 2, and we see paragraph 7 there, you refer to John Rowan Partners as a construction company dealing with construction projects in both the private and public sector. In your police statement, you give a little more detail. We don't need to have it up, but you describe John Rowan Partners as a multidisciplinary property and construction consultancy offering project management, quantity surveying, building surveying, health, safety and planning. The services offered by John Rowan Partners included what you describe as site monitoring and supervision services?
It is, yes.
But also providing clerk of works services for building projects?
Yes. Well, I'm sure we're going to go into that in a bit more detail.
You were not John White's line manager. That was Louis Zaroa, wasn't it?
It was, yes.
Did Louis Zaroa report to you?
He did.
Can you just explain your role within that department? So what it was that you did specifically?
Again, I would have overall responsibility for the team, and then I would line manage some of our associates who would then, that would cascade down to different parts of our team. So we'd have building surveyors, clerk of works site inspectors at that time.
So that was a managerial role?
It was, yes.
And what qualified you to have that role?
Experience. I'd been at the firm since 2004, worked my way up. I managed people along the way. I was responsible for putting bids together and just general management.
Do you have any technical background or qualifications?
Yes, I'm a chartered building surveyor.
Prior to 2014, what experience did John Rowan Partners have of working on projects with rain screen cladding systems?
So in my 16 years of being there, we have two teams. We have two teams. We work in the public sector and the private sector, but we also work in new build housing and refurbishment. So in both those elements, so on the new build housing side, we had experience in working with cladding on high-rise buildings, and I think two of them at that time were ACM or rain screen cladding.
Do you know around what time that would have been, so what year?
It would have been, could have been any time between 2008 onwards.
And was that within the Clerk of Works site supervision team, or was that a different area of the business that was working on those
So
projects?
that would have been on the new build, which would have been the employer's agent side, and we would have worked as a site inspector on some of those, and on others there would have been other site inspectors.
And again, prior to 2014, did John Rowan Partners have any direct experience of working on high-rise residential recladding projects?
Yes.
So that's the same ones that you're talking about?
Yeah.
Were you aware of the requirements of Schedule 1, Part B, fire safety of the building regulations?
I would have been aware of the building regulations, but not specific.
Were you aware of Part B3, internal fire spread?
Same answer.
Okay, so the same would go for Part B4.
Yeah.
What about the guidance in Approved Document B?
Again, yeah. So I would have had an awareness of it.
So aware that it existed?
Aware that it had existed. In my training, I would have been on courses on legislation, CPDs, and things like that.
Would you have known what Approved Document B advised with regard to the external surface of a building?
At that time, not specifically, no.
And you've referred to your training as giving you a background in the legislation. When you were in your managerial roles from 2008 onwards, were you attending CPD or courses on Approved Document B or the building regulations?
I would have, because I'm a chartered surveyor, I would have had to have done my CPD. So as part of that, I would have been keeping up to date with changes in legislation and anything that was coming through at that time.
Would you have expected those that you were contracting out for Clerk of Works or site supervision work to be familiar with Approved Document B?
I would have expected them to be familiar with more than just Approved Document B, but the rest of the approved documents that were there as a general Clerk of Works or site inspector.
And that would be familiar with what it actually says rather than just having a general knowledge that it's out there.
It would be an awareness. It would be an awareness. And it's probably worth the reason why, because Clerk of Works and site inspectors, whichever way you want to call them in the terminology, we'll talk a bit about that. In my experience, 95% of the Clerk of Works, general building Clerk of Works, have come through the trades. They're ex-labourers, they're plasterers, they're electricians. So their awareness would be of general building. So that gives a bit of background.
I'm now going to ask you about your role on the Grenfell project. Before I go on to ask you some detailed questions about the contract with KCTMO, I just would like to clarify your role. You were the manager within John Rowan Partners responsible for the contract with KCTMO, is that right?
The bid came through to me, yeah.
Did you go to site yourself at any point?
No.
Did John White or Tony Batty ever discuss what they observed on site or their site reports with you?
No.
If we could go to JRP 6010. This is an email from you to Claire Williams dated 16th of July 2014. We'll come back to it under a separate topic, but you'll see there in the third paragraph, you refer to Louis Aroa and say he will manage the Clerk of Works from our side internally and will also be your main point of contact from a management point of view. And then you go on. Was that you effectively handing the job over to Louis Aroa?
Yeah, at that time he would have been managing the Clerk of Works site inspectors and would have had the day-to-day responsibility for those members in that team.
Were you involved at all in the contract after that?
I would have had TBMs, which are task-based management meetings with Luis, one-to-ones, so to speak, further down the line, just to have a feel and understanding of what was going on in these projects.
So at those meetings, you would have asked him about what was happening on the Grenfell project?
Yeah, just a general update on how things are progressing, what's going on, are there any issues?
Did any particular issues come up in those meetings?
No, only what insofar as happened after this email that we were asked to meet with Claire in September, and then the feedback I got was that they haven't asked for us to return until a later period, and that was as far as we got at that point.
So when Tony Batty and John White were actually on site carrying out inspections, you weren't aware of any issues or problems?
Again, it would have been general updates from Luis, and I can't recall there being any issues or challenges now.
If we could go to JRP 50295, please, page 17. We'll come back to this document again, but this is your bid submission to the TMO in response to their invitation to tender. If we just look at the second paragraph from the bottom, so scrolling down, yes, thanks. It says, Gurpal, who heads up our Clerk of Works team, will also conduct quarterly meetings with your development directors, obtaining updates on current projects and your future objectives to improve efficiencies, understand challenges, and add value at all levels. We know that John Rowan Partners was working with the TMO on other projects. Were these quarterly meetings supposed to cover all John Rowan Partners projects, or were they specific to Grenfell?
Good question. We had two teams from our business working with KCTMO. So PSR, which is Public Sector Regeneration, had won the framework for multidisciplinary services on the kitchen and bathrooms programme. So the CRM there would have been in earlier, and the client relationship manager would have been earlier in with KCTMO maybe a year before this. So there were meetings, quarterly meetings, I think. I wouldn't have the dates or whether they were quarterly. It just depends on when the client would be available, when you can get dates in the diary. But they would look at the overall picture. I didn't personally have that, because if there's a CRM already attending that meeting, then one person going would cover it.
Yeah. So when it says Gurpal will also conduct quarterly meetings, that didn't actually happen?
I didn't know.
So you wouldn't have been aware if Grenfell came up at any of those meetings?
We would have had, whoever would have gone to that meeting, the CRM would have fed back notes if there was anything.
And was there anything?
No.
So we'll move on now to ask you some questions about the contract with KCTMO. You were the individual who dealt with the tender.
Yes.
And was it you who actually put the bid together yourself?
I would have worked with the marketing team.
How did you find out that the TMO was seeking bidders for this project?
I believe an email came through from procurement to the CRM, and then it was passed on to us as the Clerk of Works site inspectors to prepare the bid, or look at the bid first, of course.
Did anyone at the TMO ever tell you why they were seeking to engage a Clerk of Works?
Only what I can read in the bid that was presented.
Can we go now to the invitation to tender, which is at JRP 6011? So page 1, that's titled Site Monitoring and Supervision Services, Improvements and Enhancements to Grenfell Tower. Do you see that?
Yep.
And moving on then to page 4. it states under the heading requirements that the TMO requires an organisation to provide 2 clerks of works to assist in the supervision and monitoring of the works. One clerk of works should have experience in mechanical and electrical installations, and the other with building works, and then in brackets, ideally with experience of the installation of external cladding. Did you note at the time that the TMO was looking for a building clerk of works with experience of the installation of cladding?
I think with this document you have to look at it in its entirety. So, and I'm hoping we can go back and look at the first page of this. But yes, as I read that, ideally with a general building clerk of works, yes. So the skill set of a clerk of works is required to carry out supervision and monitoring of the works is the first thing that would register in my mind. Then reading that on, in brackets, ideally with experience of installation of external cladding. Now, cladding comes in many different forms, tile, glass, you name it. So in terms of experience, we had that within our resources. So reading that, at that point of looking at this document, fine, I understand that. You then see experience, another clerk of works should have experience in mechanical and electrical installations. Okay, that's fine. But I think you need to look at the page before this to get the full context of how I would have looked at the document.
Well, we can do that now. If we go back a page then to page 3. And there it sets out, under background to the procurement requirement, it gives some background to the Grenfell Tower refurbishment.
Yeah, so...
Second paragraph, it says, a project has been approved to undertake the following works, new external cladding and double glazed windows to all flats.
Yeah, so in terms of reading this, I mean, I would have read this document 3 or 4 times before I'd start considering it fully, just to make sure I fully understand it. Now, you read that, new external cladding and double glazed windows to all flats. I understand that, that's part of the project. Then there's more detail on, you've got a communal heating system going in, you've got the installation of individual HIUs, surface run central heating with each flat, there's 120 flats, hot, cold water services, 7 new flats, re-provision of a nursery and a boxing club. And something that resonates with me at this time of reading that document, all flats will remain occupied during construction works. That's massive. That it's a live site. So when I read that, I look at that thinking, okay, there's external cladding going on. I understand, yes. But when you read all flats will remain occupied during the construction works, that's from our experience and our site inspectors and clerk of works who've worked in that area. When you're dealing with that amount of work, and the amount of disruption it causes for residents, you need some experience of understanding how you'd work in that building. So they're the things that I would have considered. Then you look at the second paragraph, and it's a design and build contract. And then it goes on to say, the contract administrator, CDM coordinator is Atilia. The Max Fordham has been appointed as a technical advisor to provide the KCTMO with technical support relating to M&E. Now, to me, reading that document, there's a lot of stuff going on internally, and the TMO have appointed someone specialist to look at the mechanical element. So to me, that's an extra layer that's been put in, which they, at the time of reading this is an important part for them. That causes them concern. So then when I look at the next page, and then you read that in the context of a clerk of works to provide site inspection, and the building clerk of works, so general building clerk of works, ideally to have experience, it doesn't, if it said there, I need an expert facade engineer to check the external cladding, that would raise a red flag in my mind. It would have raised a red flag in my mind because I would have asked the question internally, do we have that resource? If we haven't got it, I'd have to bring that in. Like what we had to do with the mechanical and electrical, we had to bring that resource in to deliver that aspect.
So Max Fordham, you knew, would have been more on the M&E side as a specialist advisor.
Yeah.
And if I understand what you're saying, that means that you thought you needed to get a specialist M&E clerk of works.
I didn't say we needed to get a specialist clerk of works. what it says there is ideally have experience in external cladding, which we did. At that point, we didn't know what type of cladding it was.
Just going through your answer in stages, you did subcontract out the M&E work to Tony Batty.
Yes.
And was that because from this document you formed the impression that the M&E works were going to be complicated and also important to the TMO?
That was a request. They asked for a mechanical electrical clerk of works. We do not have that in-house, therefore we subcontracted that out.
And focusing on the cladding, did anything in this bid give you any indication that it was rain screen cladding that was going to be installed?
No.
Did you form an impression from this bid that the general clerk of works was to have a more limited role than the M&E clerk of works?
Could you just repeat that again, please? Sorry.
So at the time, from reading this document, did you form any impressions about whether the general building clerk of works was to have a more limited role than the M&E clerk of works?
I'd say that they were both limited.
Why do you say that?
You've got to fundamentally look at what the role was, so site inspection and monitoring services. And you look at the contract. It's a design and build contract where the client has transferred the responsibility for, ultimately, they've transferred the responsibility for a product to be designed, fully compliant, and to the best quality they can build it. Now, when I see that, I know contractually that a clerk of works isn't necessary for this job because there isn't that requirement. So I know instantly my role is limited. If I was a full-time clerk of works on a traditional contract, the risk is more with the client and the architect in terms of compliance and the extent by the architect, by extension, employs a clerk of works to be his eyes and ears, and traditionally it would be full-time on site. So you have maximum exposure to a site. You'll understand what's going on in meetings, subcontractor meetings, if anyone's turning up to the site, any issues which perhaps someone would want to keep to themselves, your ear would be to the wall, so you'll know. So for me, that's already a major shift. And then when you get to looking at the site inspection role, that break's already there. Does that make sense? So I'm only, and it's subject to what the client wants you to do under this contract, because this is a client-led appointment and it's limited to a site-based inspection. I'm only involved in that element. So once they're on site, I'm inspecting site.
So where there is a design and build contract and where you have formed the view that a full-time clerk of works isn't necessary or isn't what's being asked for, why wouldn't the client want a more limited role to be their eyes and ears on site, even if it's just a day a week?
Could you say that again? Sorry, I missed the first part.
So where you have a design and build contract, which is what we have here, and where you know you're not going to be on site every day, why wouldn't the client want the clerk of works on those days to be their eyes and ears?
On the days that they're not there?
No, the days that they are.
Why would they want them to be?
Why wouldn't they?
Why wouldn't they? Sorry, you've confused me there.
My understanding of your answer was that a clerk of works that's on site every day is the client's eyes and ears.
Yeah.
Is that different for a clerk of works who's only on site one day a week?
I understand what you mean now. Yes, they would still be their eyes and ears, but the difference is in the amount of information they'll be able to glean on that one day compared to being there 5 days a week.
If we could go now to page 4, of this document, back to the section headed requirements, and at the second half of the page, if we zoom in on that. Go down there. It says there that the duties of the clerk of works shall comprise, but not be limited to, and I'll just pick out a few. Second bullet point down, have access to the drawings and specification and be familiar with the same, using them as a reference when inspecting the work. And then a few more bullet points down, taking measurements and samples on site to make sure that the work and the materials meet the specifications and quality standards. And then third bullet from the bottom, being familiar with the legal requirements and checking that the work complies with them. Would you say that description accords with the tasks a clerk of works normally undertakes?
Yeah, this is a standard generic lift from the Institute of Clerk of Works, and they term it Clerk of Works stroke site inspector. So yes, this is a generic.
But that is what the TMO was asking your company to do on site. Do you agree?
I agree that was part of it. There was further instructions that were provided later on, specific instructions.
We'll come to those a little bit later. In relation to have access to the drawings and specification and be familiar with the same, what did you understand that to mean at the time?
So under site inspection, I would expect that we'd have a general understanding on what's being built. If you're a site inspector and you're working on site and you're joining a project when it's on site, you've got to get yourself familiar with what the work is so you can plan, manage and work your way around a site. Now you can be a site inspector on a £175 million project or a £10 million project. Now I wouldn't expect on either that you would review thousands of drawings because you're asked to visit on site. And if you could scroll, up, and there's a little clue. Mobilisation period, intermittent involvement until work start on site proper. Now, they've even indicated 2 to 3 days there for pre-start meetings and familiarising yourselves with specs and planning requirements. Now that gives you a gauge of how they anticipate it and how we would see it. Now, therefore, you'd have a general understanding of the building works that are taking place, and then when you're on site, you'll have a better understanding of how that all starts to work.
But you would expect a clerk of works under this contract to at least be familiar with what had been specified on site.
Yes, I would expect them to have read the document and then looked at it and familiarise themselves on site when they're there, if necessary.
And that would include the specification for the cladding?
It would be just getting a general flavour for the whole project. That's one element of it, yes.
Yes, so looking at the specification and seeing what materials were being used as part of the external facade. Sorry, you need to say yes. If it is yes. So the transcribers can hear you. In practice, if one of your team spotted on site that works did not match the specification, would you expect them to raise this?
So if they were walking around on site and they spotted that something wasn't in accordance with the drawings, then you would expect them to pick it up if they saw it.
So if they had familiarised themselves with the specification and they saw a material that wasn't in the specification being installed on site, that's something they should be raising?
If they saw it, yes.
Surely that's the sort of thing they should be checking for, though.
Well, in terms of his walk around on site, they would be looking around, and if they saw something that wasn't right, they would raise it and put it in their report.
So that's the extent then of what you'd expect someone to do under this contract, is walk around, and if there was an obvious problem that they saw, they could raise it, but they wouldn't go and ask who was working on site, what are you installing?
I think the key here is it's a design and build program, so it's fluid. Yeah. So, in a traditional sense, a contract, if it was a traditional project, the tender drawings would have probably have been full plans, approved building regs drawings, for example. So from the outset of a project, you'll know what's being built. So it's slightly easier. On a design and build, it's more fluid, so things can change. So it's very important in this one day that you're on site that you have that general walk around and you ask the questions where you can and you check whether because they're working close, the contractor is working closer with building control, and that's important here. And we would ask the questions from what they have seen and what's being built, is that in accordance and is it approved? So if building control had been there and said there was an issue with what they are seeing, then I would expect John or whichever site inspector to pick up that issue and raise it.
We'll come on to the topic of building control in a moment. The Clerk of Works were intended to be on site 1 day a week each during the construction period. That's what it says in this document. That's a regular attendance on site, isn't it? 1 day a week.
It depends what's regular. I mean, some clients might turn around and say, well, once a month might be regular for them.
But it's not the case that the Clerk of Works was coming, walking around, seeing what was happening, and then not coming back for weeks on end. They would have been regularly up to date on what was happening.
We were asked to visit site once a week.
And so they should know then what changes were happening on site on a weekly basis, shouldn't they?
Well, it depends what they're doing on that day. And then this is where I think you've got to look at the specific requirements, what the client had asked us to do. And we can do that at some point. So their job would be to walk around and understand what's going on that job. And that's limited to talking to Rydens, who are the principal contractor in charge of understanding what they do on site. So I would expect us to walk around, get a general feel for what the client has asked us to do and prepare in our report.
During the construction period, if the design changed, that's something that the Clerk of Works would have been informed about.
Well, you've got to remember on this, the client didn't instruct us to attend any design team meetings, and for the first 6 months from when we did start, we still weren't involved in any site progress meetings. So in terms of picking up that knowledge, John would have had to pick that up from his site inspections.
How is it that you can expect a Clerk of Works to do their job if, as you're saying, they may not be aware of design changes or what's happening on site?
Well, you'd hope from that inspection that he picks up that information by asking the question.
Moving on, if we could go back to the bottom half of that page again. And just to ask you about the requirement to be familiar with the legal requirements and checking that the work complies with them. Did you note that requirement at the time you were preparing the tender?
Sure, yes.
And I think you said in the industry that's a standard term for a Clerk of Works appointment.
Yes.
What did you understand the legal requirements to be?
I think you need to be more specific in compliance can be many things. So in your terms.
Well, it's written there, be familiar with the legal requirements. Knowing what you knew of this job from the tender, what were those legal requirements?
So legal requirements, in my mind, there's too many different parts to this. So let me try and break it down into what I think. In terms of building compliance, I would, in this instance, say that we would be checking that the works were compliant by asking the question of building control and the principal contractor. And I back that by saying something I said earlier, that the general building clerk of works, you have to understand where their background is. They could be a labourer, they could be a plasterer, it could be an electrician. So if they're looking at that element, they can only do it within their sphere of expertise. So if they're being asked to check whether something is compliant as the design, I would expect them to ask the expert who's responsible for that element, because they wouldn't be an expert in every single facet of every approved document and the general building.
So on this job, you knew that cladding formed part of it.
Sure.
You selected John White for the role. You knew he had some experience of cladding. And we heard on Thursday that he had done one rain screen cladding project before. So on the basis of your answer, would you have expected him to know of the building regulations requirements for cladding systems?
I would have expected him to have an awareness of the building regulations and ask the question to those who are responsible for compliance.
If we could go to paragraph 34 of your statement to the inquiry, which is JRP 50333, page 8. And it's paragraph 34 at the bottom. You say, it's my understanding that all considerations relevant to the building regulations should have been dealt with by the principal contractor and those professional bodies dealing with design planning and specifications. And then on to the next page, paragraph 36, you're asked the question, did anyone at JRP form a view as to whether the design of the refurbishment of the tower complied with the relevant building regulations? And you answer that there, no, because it was not part of JRP's remit. Having looked at the clause in the invitation to tender with me, do you agree now that it was intended that John Rowan and Partners' role was to check for compliance with the building regulations?
No.
But that's what it says in the tender.
It asks us to.
If we could go back.
So you've got to go back. If you go back to the previous paragraph, the one that you.
Well, we'll go back to the invitation to tender there, so you can see the words again, which is JRP. I just lost my reference there for a second. JRP 6011, page 4. Okay. It says there very clearly in the third bullet point from the bottom that the Clerk of Works' duties shall be being familiar with the legal requirements and checking that the works comply with them. It doesn't say check that those responsible are checking, does it?
It doesn't either. So let's go back to what the design and build contract was. The responsibility under a design and build contract is for the principal contractor to provide the client with a product which is fully compliant, designed to a top quality. Now, they have been paid a fee to design and ensure the compliance of that. We haven't, what I'm trying to say there is we haven't been part of that process. We're coming in on site and those discussions and those issues are being addressed by others of which we're not involved. So the best we can do is by asking the question, have you guys check that it's compliant and have building control approved it?
But your client here is asking you to check. Why is the terms of the design and build contract relevant at all?
No, what I'm trying to show you there is the distinction of where that lies. Now, if you're asking me to, actually, what would be good is if you can, what do you think it means is probably going to help me answer the question better. What in your mind, I'm a bit unclear as to what you're asking me to answer.
Well, I'm interested in your evidence and your answers to these questions. So I'm asking you the questions. And all I'm asking you is, given that it just says checking that the work complies with them, why it is that you formed the view that that was limited to checking that building control were checking.
Okay. Are you asking that we should have, or are you implying that we should have checked each design and validated it for compliance?
I'm trying to understand what your understanding of the rule was. And I think
let me see if I can help. What I think is being put to you for your comment, agreement or disagreement, is that this line in the duties requires your building inspector to be aware of all the legal requirements applicable to the work and to ensure that they are all complied with. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yes.
No,
What do you say about that?
I don't think it's to ensure, I think it's to check. And by checking is asking the question of those who are responsible for compliance to confirm that it complies or not. And the reason is because if you're asking us to confirm that it all complies, I would probably need 15 different experts for every single approved document to confirm that it complies, which is not what the client is intending. They've already procured a design and build contract for the principal contractor to take that responsibility.
All right, thank you.
What value was John Rowan Partners adding to the client if all it was doing was checking that building control was checking?
I think we were asked by the client, and there's a specific email of what they requested us to do, and it was to inspect site and report on, I think, 5 or 6 different aspects of the project and identify any issues that we would find. And the reports, to be fair, do pick up issues and areas that needed to be addressed. So there is value in that. Part of that also was, and one of the requirements from the TMO was to engage with the residents in terms of dealing with their issues, and there were issues. And it's a disruptive program of works, and the client had asked for John to either attend meetings with residents who may have had issues with works and what's going on, so they were there to help the process. So I think that the value is there. The value is there.
But details of the building control visits to site were included in the ride-in progress reports. So if it was just a matter of the Clerk of Works looking at those reports and reporting that back to the client, what additional value is there?
Well, it wasn't just picking out from the minutes, it was also asking the question of ride-ins when they were there and getting just a general feel. So that's one aspect of it. You know, there's 5 other elements that were being reported on. But if you're going to hone in on building control, that is one aspect, but there's 5 other elements which were just as important.
Should the Clerk of Works not check for himself precisely what building control was checking by talking to them directly?
Well, we didn't have a contractual relationship with them, number one, and then the practicality of it is you're attending site once a week. If they're there on site, you may see them, you may not. And generally what tends to happen is the contractual relationship is between the principal contractor and building control, and they're dealing with it. We're almost like a fly on the wall. So we'll pick up that information from logs. So it really does depend on when you visit site, because there isn't an obligation for our site inspector, for building control to engage with us because we have no link with them.
So it's just a matter of chance then as to whether...
If you meet them, yes. If it could be a matter of chance, yes. So that's why you look at the log.
In practice, if one of your team spotted on site that works did not comply with the building regulations, you would expect them to raise this, wouldn't you?
As per the design, yeah.
What about obvious breaches? For example, an absence of cavity barriers around the windows?
If it was an issue of, if that's what it said in the design and it wasn't fitted, then yes.
Not compliance with the design, but non-compliance with approved document B. So approved document B is clear that you require cavity barriers around the windows. Isn't that something a clerk of works should have noticed?
Well, the
raised?
design, yeah, the design had already been prepared, and a significant amount. I remember from looking at one of the reports that building control had approved the top 3 floors for compliance. So therefore, John would have picked that up, and that's what the model was that followed all the way down.
But if the clerk of works knew that the guidance under ADB said cavity barriers around the windows, and he saw on site there weren't any there, would you expect him to at least query this with the designer as to why they weren't there?
Well, it would depend.
On what?
Number one, the design had already been approved. Yeah, there are instances where you may spot something, but ultimately it's a responsibility. We could say we don't like the colour of that wall, or that doesn't look quite right. It's for the principal that can be raised, and it's for the principal. Words right. For the principal contractor to address or not, or ignore what we say, because if the design complies, that's the overriding position.
Can't it?
So in this instance, the design complied.
Did it ever occur to you that both building control and the clerk of works could be responsible for checking compliance with the building regulations?
In which way?
Well, did it ever occur to you that it could be both building control and the clerk of works? So just because building control are doing it doesn't mean that there's no separate obligation under the contract with the TMO on the clerk of works to do it.
See, I think there's 2 different things at play there. I think one is you'd be looking for workmanship, quality of workmanship as a site inspector. And if you'd spotted something which wasn't in accordance with the designs and it was obvious, you would pick it up and you'd put it in your report.
Did you have any contact with KCTMO about this project after you handed over to Louisa Roa?
Did I have any contact with KCTMO?
Yes. So we looked at the email where you handed
In
over...
relation to this project?
Yes, in relation to this project.
No, I don't think I did.
So were you aware of whether the KCTMO ever said to those who did have contacts, so Louisa Roa, John White, Tony Batty, that JRP's role was in fact not to check for compliance with legal requirements?
They would check compliance by checking that building control are happy with what they did.
But were you aware of any conversation with the TMO where that was made clear?
I'm aware that there was a meeting with the client where she set out her specific requirements.
Were you aware of any difference between what you thought JRP's role was and what the TMO thought JRP's role was?
Say that again, sorry?
Were you aware of any difference between what the TMO thought you might be doing and what you had interpreted the clerk of works role to be?
No. And the reason being is that at that time when I was contacted by Claire Williams, she had said she would be looking at the terms of our appointment and we'll meet later on. So in my mind, I do remember that vividly, that I said to all three, actually, Louise, John and Tony, make sure you understand exactly what the brief is from the client, what they want exactly and precisely what they want us to do.
Could we go to TMO 20840364? So that is Claire Williams, one of Claire Williams' statements to the inquiry. If we could go to page 7 at paragraph 34, please. So this is how Claire Williams describes JRP's role, which is TMO also engaged John Rowan and partners as clerk of works to inspect various works on site. This included inspection of workmanship and quality to ensure works were carried out as designed and to challenge Ryden when necessary if there were shortcomings. They also had a role to report on health and safety issues. This was an additional tier of inspection to ensure works were completed to a good standard and to ensure the landlord's future maintenance risk was limited. Do you agree with that description of your role?
Yes, and I'll explain why I think parts of it do. The inspection of workmanship and quality, if you're inspecting on a weekly basis, part of the report was to have a look at the quality of workmanship, and if you spot any issues, raise that in your report. As far as I'm aware, the works were completed as designed. In terms of health and safety issues, it would have been general site safety issues, which would have been picked up in the report. And then we were asked to check the finishes, snag the finish, so to speak, if that makes sense.
You say, as far as you know, the works were carried out as designed. How do you know that?
Again, by asking the question and checking whether building control had any issues.
Moving on, you say at paragraph 11 of your statement that John Rowan Partners' appointment was for site monitoring and supervision services. We don't need to pull that up. And at paragraph 17 of your statement, you say that the services were not clerk of works in a typical sense. John White has used similar terminology in his statement and evidence to the inquiry. Is this something you've discussed with him before coming here today?
I've been discussing this with clients and our team for 16 years. Site inspection, I see confusion for those who are not involved in doing this type of work. Clerk of works in its traditional sense, and I think John's already spoken about how that works. But when you read clerk of works as it is there, it feels like it's a fuller role than what it is if you're a site inspector.
Mr. Virdee, I think it would help me and perhaps others if you were just to give us a brief description of what you understand to be the role of a clerk of works in the full sense, and compare it with what you understand to be the role of a site inspector.
Yeah. In the traditional sense, it's worth understanding that the client, if it's a traditional contract, the client is ultimately responsible for the compliance. All the risk pretty much sits with them, and then they appoint an architect who is a lead designer, and obviously that contractual obligation passes on to them to make sure that the design is compliant. And you would probably engage a clerk of works At that point, I might add, again, it would be someone who's a general clerk of work, so it could have been a labourer, plasterer, I keep saying that. And they would get an understanding of what the job is from the start, so they've got a good feel for it. Now, the tender package and what would go out to a contractor to price would probably be on the basis of an approved set of drawings which have been through building control. So you've got no ambiguity in what the design is. So you're very, very clear what it is. That would go out to tender. And then obviously once it's on site, you wouldn't expect the lead architect to be on site full time because that'd be a fairly expensive way of running a project. And the clerk of works would be the person on site full time, have his own site office, have those drawings to hand, and work the site. Ultimately, the clerk of works will have probably a far greater understanding of that project than anyone else. He'd be on site and he would have access to all the contractor meetings. So if there's issues being raised between contractor and subcontractor or challenges with how they're to do the work, he'd have a good understanding of it and he could feed that back up the chain. If building control were inspecting, they may not be because it's an approved set of drawings. Therefore, building control may not have ever attended site. So for me, the clerk of works has huge exposure to the site and what's going on at any given time throughout that project.
And it sounds to me as though you're describing a person who is acting as the representative of the architect, who is himself responsible for the design and oversight of the construction work by a contractor who is simply there to build.
Build, yes.
All right, thank you.
Yes.
And now what about a site inspector?
So a site inspector, as we've said, is my experience in dealing with site inspection is only with design and build contracts. So I've never dealt with it. I know others within the business have worked, and we've got clerk of works who have worked as the traditional clerk of works, so they're best placed. We're not, as we said earlier, the design and build contract, the client has passed all that responsibility over to the principal contractor for a set price. I want X, Y, Z, and you design it. You get the experts in who need to design it, and you obtain that approval, and you build it, and you give me that top quality product at the end with fully compliant and set. Now, the site inspector hasn't been involved. I mean, you can use this project, a great example of it. It started in 2012. We didn't get on the site until 2015. So there's a hell of a lot of work that's been done before then. And we're not involved in, we don't have that information. We do not understand what's going on. We've been asked to enter the project at a specific time to have a look at what's going on site. And you don't have that exposure because you're there. The client could have said, come in once a month. You'd only pick up what you would see on that one day. And there's probably a lot of things that you need to pick up in that one day. Does that help?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Ms. Grogan, I'm sorry I interrupted your questioning, but I thought it would be helpful, certainly for me and others, just to understand these labels that are being attached by people to different roles.
Well, yes, Mr. Chairman, that was in fact going to be my next question, but I'll skip
I
over it now.
apologise in that case.
Can you account for why it is that the duties set out in the invitation to tender for this project are more extensive than the site supervisor role that you've in fact described just now?
Say that again, sorry.
Can you explain why it is? So we looked at the invitation to tender and the list of duties of a clerk of works, and your evidence was that's a pretty standard description of a clerk of works.
Or site inspector, yeah.
Or a site inspector. You've described a more limited role of a site inspector to the chairman and Mrs. Stefan just now. Can you explain why it is that what John Rowan Partners actually did on site seems to be more limited than those duties set out in the ITC?
You can only pick up based on the requirement of what your role is, if that makes sense. if you want to, do you want to pull up the scope again?
So that's JRP 6011, page 4. And we've been looking at the second half of the page there, under the sentence, the duties of the clerk of works shall comprise, but not be limited to.
So can you repeat the question again now, please?
Can you explain why the role of site inspector that you've described and what we know John White was actually doing on site seems to be less extensive than this list of duties here?
See, I think it's the same in terms of it's a limited role. So you apply the, look at the first one. It says by daily signing in and out of site. He's not there daily for a start. So you've got to apply the limit. This is a generic document. Have access to the drawings and specification. We've got access to the drawings and specification, and we use them to walk around. You may not carry 300 drawings with you as you walk around site. So if you have a general understanding of what the works are, and then if you spot an issue, you raise it. So when you start looking at that, and you understand what the site inspector is there to do, then it makes sense.
If we could go now to MET 302369991. And just before we look at this document as it's loading, can I ask you, did you ever make it clear to the TMO what limitations you thought applied to this role?
No, I think they know what the limitations are because of how they've set their brief. For example, you look at that first part of the table where it says 2 to 3 days to assess the drawings and specs for an £8.5 million job. 2 to 3 days, and it includes pre-start meetings. So if John, Tony, and Luis had been to a pre-start meeting in September, that's 1.5 days taken out of that, which leaves another day and a half. So I think it's a question for the TMO ultimately as to what they thought. But when you look at that document and what they have put down there, a familiarisation of the drawings is the general one for a site inspector to hit the ground running.
This is Tony Batty's witness statement given to the police. You see at the very bottom of the page, he starts explaining what his role is. So he says, my role is clerk of works, and what that means is that when a job comes up, I'll check the drawings and, onto page 2, make sure that bit has been installed as per the drawings, even if we have designed the mechanical and electrical installation ourselves. If there is a fault with the drawings, I will identify it, highlighting what the fault is. I will check the whole thing for quality all the way through, right down to when they do the commissioning, and make sure that it's working right. I do that on loads of different projects, such as health, residential schools. Having conducted the inspections of mechanical and electrical design and installation, I would report back my findings to the client. Can you account for why Tony Batty seems to have thought his role involved checking the installation against the drawings and for faults with the drawings?
Well, let's go back to the brief. They've asked for a mechanical and electrical clerk of works. And if you look at the brief, they also appointed Max Fordham as a technical advisor. So and we've got a general building clerk of work. So that's a specific skill set where he's looking at things in that manner. And I think the package there was it was not as onerous as the overall building package. Now, can you start again with your question? I think I've just answered a bit of it and I've lost train of thought on the second part.
Well, I was just asking you why it appears that Tony Batty thought his role was different to the role you've described John White as undertaking. I think you have answered that.
Okay.
Did you ever have a discussion with Tony Batty about what he was required to do on the project, or did you leave that up to him to work it out?
No, they all went to the same same meeting. I wanted them all there to understand exactly what the brief is from the client.
If we go now to your bid to the TMO, which is JRP 50295, and we go to page 3, you refer to both John White and Anthony Batty there at the bottom as clerk of works. If they weren't performing the clerk of works role, why did you describe them in that way in the tender?
Because the document asks for a clerk of works skill set to deliver site inspection and monitoring services.
On page 12 of this document, you give case studies of projects in response to question 3 of the invitation to tender. Question 3 is there at the top and says, please provide details of 3 contracts or projects which you consider demonstrate comparable requirements to those of this contract. Example 1, under the heading details of clerk of works services provided, you say we provided dedicated site-based experience clerk of works who established benchmarking, live quality samples, robust inspection snagging regime, reported on progress and supported HFH on resident liaison. That was a site-based clerk of works role, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, so that was someone on site every day. Case study 2.
Sorry, is that right? Every
Yes.
day?
Yes.
Sorry, you do need to say yes or no
Sorry,
rather than just nodding. Case study 2, the second list of bullet points there. Again, it says we provided a multidisciplinary service, single point responsibility for the following: clerk of works, contract administration, project management, and the list goes on. Was that also a site-based clerk of works role?
I can't remember now.
And if we go on to page 13, that's case study 3. Again, that appears to be a clerk of works role rather than the site inspector role. Do you agree?
Sorry, let me just read the project again. No, this is slightly different. This is where a project, not one of ours, where they had, I think, over 4,000 defects, and I think it may have been it was a JCT form of contract, and we were asked to go in. It says they're independent certifier. So if you can scroll down a bit. And this was 2 phases. The first phase was to identify what the defects were, and the second phase was to recall the contractor to rectify their issues, and they were to provide the design and to ensure its compliance. We were monitoring that the work was completed, and I think we were on site full time because they had to do the work and then close up. So we had to monitor that it was done. The sign-off and compliance of the specific products were by the contractor. So we were monitoring that it was being completed, if that makes sense.
So the first 2 case studies, at least, were for that more traditional clerk of works role that you've described. As you had interpreted this contract as being for the more limited site supervisor role, why did you give those examples?
If you go back to 1 and 2, and something I said at the start, it was working on live sites. Properties are an occupation, and that covered the bandwidth because the clerk of works would have had experience of working in those environments.
The bid itself doesn't make any distinction between the traditional clerk of works role and the site supervisor monitoring role. Why did you not explain that in the bid?
Well, I think it does. If you look at the brief again, a traditional clerk of works, in my mind, would have been on site 24, or you say 5 days a week, and here we've been specifically requested to attend on a 1 day a week basis to provide a report as per the client's request.
Could we go to TMO 1 306200 and page 2, please? Oh, sorry, if we could go back to page 1. So this is the TMO's letter dated 12th of June 2014 confirming John Rowan Partners' appointment, and it's addressed to you there. It informs you that your tender has been successful and refers to JRP providing a general building clerk of works. When you saw that letter, did you think to clarify that it was not a traditional clerk of works role, or did you think that was understood?
Sorry, I haven't seen this for 6 years.
Yeah. So it's page 2 where it refers to clerk of works.
Yeah. If you go back again, you look at it. If you go back to page 1, sorry. The reference is site monitoring and supervision services. So again, I would read that as clerk of works providing site monitoring and supervision services. This is a debate which rages on with clients, site inspectors, clerk of works, and has been going on since I've been involved in this type of work. It comes up probably every couple of weeks as to whether you should say site inspector, clerk of works, and after about 10 years you get a bit fed up of trying to point out what the job title is every time. So when I read that and I read the brief, I'm clear in my mind, and certainly those who have prepared the bid should be clear in their mind that they've asked for a clerk of works to provide site monitoring and supervision services.
Why did you not make it crystal clear to the TMO in writing that that is what you thought that this project would entail?
I read this and it's crystal clear.
Do you agree that by referring to John White and Tony Batty as clerks of works in correspondence and by them issuing reports entitled clerk of works reports, that others may have understood their role to be a more traditional clerk of works role?
I couldn't answer for them, really.
You've said, I think, in your evidence that a meeting took place between Claire Williams, John White, Tony Batty and Louisa Roa. How was what happened at that meeting reported back to you?
I think I'd seen that email probably a week or two later at the time. I definitely would have read it because I would have asked Louise what are the specific terms of our engagement here? What has KCTMO asked us to do? So we're clear.
And we've been through that email with John White. I don't think we need to go back to it.
I mean, from my perspective, if that was wrong, what we were asked to do, then I'm sure KCTMO would have fed back to us, said, sorry, that's not what we asked you to do.
Mr. Chairman, I'm about to move on to a new topic.
Yes.
I have only a few more pages to go, so I'm in your hands as to whether we break now for a short time or whether I continue for another 10 minutes, say.
Do you think you can finish in 10 minutes?
I think it's probably a little bit longer than that, actually.
Which we're going to need a break at the end of your questions anyway, aren't we?
We will, yes.
Mr. Virdee, we have a break during the middle of the morning, and normally we would take it about now. But when Council's finished asking the questions that she thinks she needs to put to you, we always have a break at that point to enable her to take stock and maybe field questions from other people who aren't in the room. And it might be more sensible if we were to try and finish Council's questioning and then take both breaks at the same time,
Sure.
if you see what I mean. Would that be all right as
Yeah,
far
that's
as you're
fine.
concerned? Well, I think that's what we'll do. But probably a quarter of an hour might do it.
Yes,
Well,
I'll
you
keep,
do-
a,
you
I'll
take
keep a
your-
close eye on the time.
Take your own time, yes, don't feel rushed.
Yes, if I feel like it's not going to be done, I'll let you know
Well,
in 15 minutes.
yes, all right.
So moving now on to the topic of building control, you've said in your statement, and the reference for the transcript is JRP 50333, page 10, that JRP had no contact with building control. JRP's employee, John White, may have had some limited contact, but not in a formal capacity. What do you mean, not in a formal capacity?
I think he informally saw him on site and had a conversation with him.
Who told you that?
That was by my investigations. I was asked a set of questions by the inquiry to answer some questions, so I made some inquiries, and that's what I found out.
So it's not something you were aware of at the time, it's something you found out later?
Yeah.
And in your view, is that sufficient to check that building control were checking, just to come
Yeah.
across them informally on site?
Say that again, sorry.
So, in your view, is the contact that John White had with building control sufficient to check that building control were checking for compliance?
Yeah, from my experience on the site inspection role, and certainly over the last 16 years, you in this particular form of contract, you would check the logs of building control rather than have direct conversations with them, because that link isn't there between the two of us. That link is between the principal contractor and building control.
And so the quality of information that you would have depends entirely on the quality of record keeping of the main contractor.
Yeah, on what's on site, yes.
At paragraph 27 of your statement, you've said, to the best of my knowledge, we, that's JRP, were never supplied with any drawings and had very limited specifications. I certainly was not provided with these personally. As a manager, would you expect to be provided with those documents personally on a job?
I'm yet to work on a project where they have successfully managed to have a full set of drawings on any online cloud-based storage facility. You tend to find that, and this is from experience, I'm talking in the generic, you may have some of the drawings on there, you may not have everything. I think also the fact that you're working on a D&B contract, some of the drawings can be fluid. They might not be there. They might be still being worked on. Your best chance of getting the most, and it's also worth pointing out, it's only as good as those who are uploading the information on the cloud. So if they haven't got that on there, then you have to rely on what's on site.
Could you answer my question, though, which is, as the manager, you wouldn't be expected to be provided with those drawings personally, would you?
You would hope to be expected that they would be provided, yes.
To you personally?
Not to me, no.
No. So what you've said in your statement there, I certainly was not provided with these personally. That
No,
doesn't really matter, does it?
No.
How do you know that on this project, John Rowan Partners were not provided with drawings?
How do I know? I don't know.
You put it in your statement. Who told you that?
If you go to your question, what was the question?
My
'Cause
question.
I think your question would have prompted me to find out.
So it's as a result of checking
Yeah.
John Rowan Partners' records.
Yeah.
So were you aware at the time that there was any issue with drawings or specifications not being provided?
I wasn't aware of it being an issue at the time, and nor would I, as I've just said earlier. It's a challenge on pretty much every job that you work on.
So in his statement to the inquiry and in oral evidence, Mr. White has said that he was able to view drawings in the site office, and he told us on Thursday there was never an occasion when he asked to see a drawing and was not provided with it. Do you agree then that what you said in your statement's not quite accurate?
No, sorry, can you explain what you mean by not accurate?
Well, you say JRP were never supplied with drawings and had very limited specifications. Mr. White says he was able to see everything he needed to see on site.
Yeah, what I'm saying there is that I wasn't sent any drawings. They would have been on site. So I'm agreeing. I think no, I'm not agreeing with. They would have been on site, and that's where he would have looked at them. What I'm saying is, if a link had been sent and didn't work, I wouldn't be concerned about that, because the drawings that you'd really need to get hold of would be on site.
Well, this passage of your witness statement gives the impression that that was a problem, that you never had drawings or access to the specifications. Yes, we'll pull it up. It's JRP 50330, page 7, paragraph 27.
To the best of my knowledge.
So the question asked by the inquiry is, what access did you have after this time?
I wouldn't have had any access, as I wouldn't have seen.
But you've answered the question on behalf of John Rowan Partners. We were never supplied with any drawings. And based on John White's evidence, I'm asking you whether you wish to correct that now.
I'm just having a bit of difficulty trying to understand what you're asking. So are you saying that the drawings were on site and that he had access to the drawings?
That is what Mr. White said, that he had access to everything he needed on site.
He had access to drawings on site if he needed to refer to. So that would make sense if he had access to them.
I think we've got the picture.
We do. Thank you.
You didn't get a set of drawings.
I didn't personally have.
No one sent a set of drawings either in physical copy or by a link to you or, I think, Mr. White. But when he wanted to see a drawing on site, he was able to get it.
Yeah,
okay.
That makes sense.
Thank you.
Moving on to a new topic, which is the price for the works. If we go back to your bid, JRP 50295, page 25. Now, you were asked to bid for, and you have in fact bid here, for 70 days per clerk of works on site. Do you see that in the box there?
Yes.
So 70 days each, and you've given a rate there. That's a total of 140 days, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
And if we could now go to JRP 50332, page 2. Now, this is the email that you think you saw a little later, dated the 18th of September, from Claire Williams to Louis Zaroa, where she summarises the meeting and her instructions. And in that first paragraph, about halfway down, she says, I said that I would like to skew the number of days potentially for each clerk of works, which was originally proposed as 40 days each. You in fact bid for many more days than that. Were you aware at the time that the requirement from the client had been reduced?
That would have come up in the TBMs I had, task-based management reviews, one-to-ones I would have had with Luis on a resourcing side of things as to who's doing what.
Do you know why the time was reduced?
I can only assume.
And what do you assume?
My understanding of that would be, so if it's skewed for M&E and less for building work, is that the M&E took precedence at that time.
I mean the overall time, so it's reduced from 140 to 80.
From 140 to 40.
140 to 80.
140 to 80. Well, again, it comes down to what we said at the start. I could have read that to be come in one day a month at that time, because it's ultimately up to the client how they wish to use that resource. So in my mind at that time, I thought, okay, if it's gone from 70 to 40, maybe they don't, maybe they're comfortable with what they're getting from the principal contractor, or it might be a budgetary issue.
Did you think that 40 hours each,
40 days.
40 days each, was sufficient to carry out the duties required of the two clerks of works?
In terms of what they were asked to do, in terms of their reports and what they were asked to do, that's not uncommon.
Moving on now to my final topic. If we could go, please, to MET 3045267. That not coming up. Can we try 45627? Yes, that's the one. That's right. That's it. So this is an email from you dated the 14th of June 2017 at 9:39 to JRP all staff. And you say, "Dear all, you may have seen the news of the tragic fire at Grenfell Tower, and I trust that the emergency services are doing all they can to save as many residents as possible. It may be worth noting that we did have some involvement on the refurbishment works that took place at the tower, albeit as site inspectors, with design and project management responsibilities resting with others." And then you go on to say you've spoken with the team. And then the next paragraph, "From having seen the footage, it appears that the external cladding/insulation has accelerated the spread of flame, which has then made its way back into the building. I suspect that once all the investigations have taken place, we may see a change in building regulations and how buildings are overclad." Had you been told anything by John White prior to this about what materials were used in the cladding?
No.
Having observed the rapid spread of flame up the tower, did you draw any conclusions about what materials may have been used?
No.
Did you have, given that so far as you knew, building control had checked the cladding and passed it as compliant with the building regulations, were you surprised to see the cladding behave that way in the fire?
Yes.
And what was it about the building regulations that you thought would need to change?
I mean, I remember seeing the footage, and I felt that there would be an issue with building regs and how projects would be run going forward, because there would obviously be an investigation into such things. So my feeling at the time was that we'll see something coming out of this.
So did you draw the conclusion that it was likely to be a failure of regulation rather than a failure of design?
I mean, I can only talk about what I know more of now, and I think there's a lot of confusing things out there in the market, and it needs to be cleared up. The more simple things do not have to be complicated. They can be very simple if there's simple instructions for everybody to follow. And I think everything has got a little bit complicated as to how things work, from procurement to responsibility to regulations, the whole lot.
If we could go now to MET 3045634. And if we go to the email from Sean Tobin at the bottom, 15th of June 2017 at 8:07 a.m., he's emailing John White, but you're also on the address list. He says, John, Peter Madison, Property Services Director at KCTMO, contacted me very late last night, 11 p.m, and has requested JRP's assistance and support in gathering as much intelligence on the refurbishment project at Grenfell Tower a couple of years back, where we were SI/COW on the project. He then goes on to list the information sought by KCTMO, and if we go down to the next page of the email chain, at the end he says, if you would like an internal meeting between all of us on this email, please let us know. And then we have to scroll back up again, back to page 1, to see the reply. And there's a reply there from Andrew Crocher. He says that John is very busy, suggests that an admin person should collate the information, and then a review should take place. Did that internal review take place?
Sorry, I haven't seen this for...
So it's the last paragraph of that email. Then we can have a review, maybe with John assisting and providing additional background. I've CC'd Luis, who needs to be aware of this as John's line manager, and also may have some additional knowledge input. Did you conduct an internal review?
Chris, I can't actually remember.
Um,
We would have sat down to discuss. I think first and foremost, I think I remember John was in a bad way, and then we sat down with Luis to talk about the project, and I think the files would have been there. So I don't know whether a full review would have been carried out. I can't remember. To be honest, I can't recall.
Do you recall, shortly after the fire, discussing what JRP's role was on the project?
I remember looking back at the brief. Yes.
And when you looked at the brief, was that consistent with your understanding of what had actually been done on site?
Yeah.
If we look at the email just from the top of this chain, we'll see John White's response. He says, for further info, that should be windows, were replaced in UPVC as part of the contract. Did you understand from this that John White had concerns about the use of UPVC?
No, I think he was just saying that the windows, I think maybe someone may have asked the question, and he's just giving us some further information.
Did the use of UPVC in the windows cause you any concern when you became aware of it?
No.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Those are all of my questions.
Right, well, that would be a
We'll have
good
our
time to
pause.
have a break then, wouldn't
Yes.
it? Mr. Virdee, we're going to have that break now. We'll come back at 5 to 12, please.
Okay.
And I don't think you're going to have much chance to talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room, but if it does occur, please don't take it, all right?
Thank you.
We'll see you in a minute. You'd like to go to the usher, please? Thank you. I think that shall give you enough time to deal with anything that might have come from elsewhere.
Yes,
Good.
thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. 5 to 12, please. Yes, would you ask Mr. Virdee to come back in, please? All right, well, now we'll see if there are any more questions. Ms. Grogan, did you find some questions?
I did just two short questions, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Mr. Virdee, what systems were in place to supervise John White and ensure he carried out his job adequately?
So he would have had task-based management one-to-ones with Luis, so whereby they would talk about all the projects that he's working on, identify any issues, challenges, and that would also include any challenges from his own workload perspective, but also any challenges that he's having on site. And then we would take it from there.
Did you ever, including after the fire, come to be aware of any concerns about how John White performed on the Grenfell project?
No, I've never after nor during.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's
All
all
right.
my questions.
Good. Well, Mr. Virdee, those are all the questions we have for you. It just remains for me to thank you very much for coming here to give your evidence this morning.
Thank
It's
you.
been very helpful to hear from you, and now you're free to go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, we'll need to rise for a few minutes before the next witness comes in so that the usual cleaning arrangements can be undertaken.
Yes, that's right. We've checked and we need 10 minutes, and then it will be Mr. Mark Osborne.
Well, what I can suggest is to come and tell us as soon as you're ready. That's the best thing.
Yes.
All right? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, Miss Grange. No.
Good morning.
Who
Yes,
are we calling next?
our next witness is Mr. Mark Osborne, please.
Thank you. Right, would you ask Mr. Osborne to come in, please?
Ask you to read the affirmation text.
I do solemnly and sincerely and truthfully declare, I affirm that the evidence shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Osborne. Would you like to sit down and make yourself comfortable, please? Right. Yes, Miss Grange.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Osborne. Thank you very much for coming and giving evidence today. It's very much appreciated. I'm going to be asking you the questions today. If you have any difficulty understanding anything I'm asking you, please either ask me to repeat the question or put the point in a different way. Also, can you please try and keep your voice up, because the lady on your right is transcribing a transcript of everything we're saying, and she needs to be able to hear you clearly. So if you can keep your voice up, that would be great. Now, you've made 2 witness statements for the inquiry. Those appear in a folder in front of you, and they're also going to appear on the screen in a moment. If we can go to the first, this is OSB 6087. So we can see there's a date on it, 27th of September 2018. And if we also go to the final page, there we have the date again. And is that your signature?
That is my signature.
Have you read that statement recently?
I have.
And are the contents true?
They are.
Thank you. And then if we can bring up your second witness statement to the inquiry, this is OSB 6090. And if we turn on to page 13, we can see that this second statement is dated the 27th of June 2019. And is that your signature there?
That is my signature.
Great. And have you read that statement recently?
I have.
And can you confirm that the contents are true?
The contents are true.
Now, Osborne Berry also provided a position statement to the inquiry, which you have referred to and expressly adopted in your second witness statement. Can we just bring that up? That's at OSB 7084. Is that the position statement that you're referring to?
It is.
Thank you. Did you assist in the preparation of that position statement?
I did.
Thank you. And again, are the contents of it true?
They are.
Thank you. And have you discussed your evidence with anyone before coming here today?
No, I haven't.
Thank you. So I just want to start with some questions about your professional background and your training. And if we look at paragraph 3 of your first witness statement, so that's OSB 6087. So I think that's on page 5, actually, of this statement. And under question 3 there, you explained to us that prior to the incorporation of Osborne Berry, you'd worked as a fitter, carrying out work for Harley for about 20 years. Do you see that there?
I do.
Now, did your work as a fitter involve the installation of building envelopes?
It did.
Were you fitting anything else, or was it always external wall features?
External only.
External only, thank you. And would that include items such as curtain walling, rain screen cladding facades, windows, doors and structural glazing?
It would.
Thank you. Now, we know that Osborne Berry was incorporated in 2002. That's right, isn't it?
That's correct.
Yeah. And so at the time of Osborne Berry's instruction by Harley in 2014 on the Grenfell Tower refurbishment, is it right that you had some 32 years experience in the installation of building envelopes?
I did.
Thank you. Have you ever undertaken any formal training or qualifications in relation to installing building envelopes?
I haven't.
So does that mean that effectively you learned on the job?
Learned
Is
as
that
I've gone along, yes.
how it happened? And did you start off as an apprentice somewhere and move up? Or?
I was an apprentice back in '73 for a company called Windshields of Worcester.
Yeah.
and then I worked my way up. I did a full apprenticeship, worked my way up then to a fitter, and then basically moved from company to company
Yeah,
till I got and set my own company up.
great, thank you. Have you undertaken any formal training or qualifications in relation to the installation of rain screen cladding facades specifically?
Not at all, no.
No. And what about any formal training in respect of fire safety in terms of installation and fitting work?
Only what I've been shown as I've gone along in the trade, basically.
Yeah, okay. Now, if we look at page 2 of your first witness statement, and we look towards the bottom of the page, you say there that Osborne Berry have installed the same cladding in other buildings in London, Hounslow and Little Venice. And you make clear right at the very bottom, you're asked these particular cladding panels and you give the answer yes. And just staying with this theme of other similar projects, if we look at page 1 of your second witness statement, that's OSB 6090, you say at paragraph 1A, you're asked about projects in which Osborne Berry were engaged by Harley Facades. And you say this, you say Osborne Berry were subcontracted to work on 5 tower blocks in Little Venice, 1 tower block in Hounslow, and a tower block and lower riser buildings in Commercial Road. So you say that there. Were these buildings, so we've got 5 tower blocks in Little Venice, 1 in Hounslow, and 1 in Commercial Road. Were they residential, non-residential, or mixed-use buildings?
I believe the Commercial Road was mixed,
Yes.
but as for Little Venice, that's 5 domestic tower blocks.
Right, yeah.
Residence based.
So solely residential, yeah. And were any of those buildings over 18 metres tall? Were they large high-rise buildings?
Little Venice, definitely 20 floors.
Yeah. And the other 2, what about Hounslow?
Hounslow, I only actually went up there to do the setting out details
Yeah,
on heights and grids. I'm off the top of my memory, I think it was 10 or 11 floors, but I wouldn't guarantee that one.
okay.
But Commercial Road, that was probably 15 floors, the tower block.
Right, yeah. And is it correct that Osborne Berry installed ACM, aluminium composite material panels, with a PE polyethylene core at the sites in Hounslow and Little Venice?
That's correct.
Yeah. So you did, as a firm, have previous experience of installing ACM to a building over 18 metres in height prior to the Grenfell project?
We did. The only difference being is that the panels at these other 2 jobs were riveted on panels,
Yes.
not hook-on panels.
Yes. So there were rivets and not cassettes, as we known or come to know them. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Was Osborne Berry a member of any trade associations at the time it worked on the Grenfell project?
No.
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 Thank you. It helps if you say an answer rather than just nod or shake
That's
your
fine.
head, so we've got something on the transcript. Thank you. And on the Grenfell project did you carry out any installation work yourself, or did you always leave that to fitters who were employed by Osborne Berry?
No, I worked on it myself as well.
So you weren't just supervising the installation of others, you actually fitted it
Physically
yourself?
Yeah.
Now, just a few questions about the preparation of your witness statements to the inquiry. If we go and look at page 5 of your first witness statement, that's OSB 6087, and at paragraph 1, you explain there that Osborne Berry in the second line is a small company, and you give a little bit more information about the company. It consists of 2 directors, yourself and Mr. Graham Berry, a secretary, Mr. Berry's wife, and 1 employee who is employed as a fitter. We've got that information there. And you also explain that on occasions the company subcontracts work and uses self-employed fitters to assist with its work. That's right, isn't it?
That is correct.
And is it correct that when you were working on site, Mr. Berry was known as Bez and you were known as Taff? Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. Now, if we can look side by side at this part of your statement, we might need to pan out so we can see paragraphs 1 through to 3 on this page 5, and we put that side by side with Mr. Berry's first witness statement at page 5. That's OSB 6086, page 5. Now, what we see here is very similar answers that are given to these first 3 questions. And in fact, so the wording of paragraphs 1, 2, and 3 they're not totally identical, but they're almost identical. And looking at paragraph 3 of your own statement there on the left, we can see in that first paragraph you say, prior to the incorporation of Osborne Berry, I had worked as a fitter carrying out work for Harley for about 20 years. Mr. Osborne was also working as a self-employed fitter for Harley. Do you see that there?
I do.
So you've referred to yourself in the third person in that part of your statement. Do you see that?
Yes.
And if you look at paragraph 1, in fact, on that same page, in the second substantive paragraph down, you've said Osborne Berry undertakes work for private individuals, companies and local authorities. And then you say it provides the labour and fitters. And then in the brackets you say this includes Mr. Osborne and myself. Do you see that there?
I do.
So again, you've talked about yourself in the third person.
Yeah.
And if we go to page 1 of your first witness statement now, OSB 6087, and if we look in that very first paragraph underneath the date, you say there, I wish to adopt the comments made in Osborne Berry's position statement, which details the extent of my involvement and that of my business partner, director, Mr. Mark Osborne. So again, you've referred to yourself in the third person there. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, would you agree with me that it looks like possibly some of this text might have been prepared for Mr. Berry's statement and has gone into your statement? Do you see that?
I do see that. But
do you agree that in large measure the 2 statements you've provided to the inquiry are very similar?
I do agree with that.
Can you help us as to how that came about? Did you sit down and prepare your statements at the same time?
No, we didn't prepare our statements at the same time, but we had talked about
Right.
different things. And
Did you discuss with each other what you were going to put in the
I
statement?
don't recall in discussing with each other that, no.
And did you check your own witness statement carefully before it was finalised? Did you have some input into the words that were used in it?
Probably not. I'm not very good at paperwork.
I see. So you've signed this witness statement, and I think you confirmed at the beginning of your evidence you have read it and checked that
I
it's
have
true.
read it, yeah.
But is it possible that at the time you first signed it, you perhaps hadn't checked it as carefully as you should have done?
I would think that is probably very true.
Okay, thank you. When you were preparing your statement or in the run-up to preparing it, did you have any documentation with you to help you and remind you about what had happened on the project?
Not at all.
Does Osborne Berry generally keep records of past projects in terms of documentation that you or the fitters would have been provided with?
No.
No.
I would keep a diary whilst the job was in progress, but those diaries wouldn't be kept after the job was finished, basically.
Okay. And what's done with those diaries? Do you destroy them?
They were destroyed.
Yeah. Okay. Now, in terms of how Osborne Berry came to be engaged on the refurbishment project, is it your understanding that in about August 2014, Mr. Ben Bailey of Harley contacted your company about whether it was interested in working on the project?
I don't recall it being Ben. I think it was Ray Bailey,
Ah, okay.
his father.
Is it right? Sorry.
And he made a telephone conversation, I believe,
Yes.
to my business partner.
Mr. Berry, is
Mr.
that
Berry.
right? Yes, so that was my next question. Is it right that it was actually Mr. Berry that took that first call
That's correct.
with the inquiry for the project?
That's correct.
And Mr. Berry, you say in your statement at paragraph 2A, we don't need to pull it up, that Mr. Berry told you that Harley had asked Osborne Berry to fit windows and cladding to Grenfell Tower. Did Mr. Berry say anything to you at that stage about whether materials had been discussed for the project and what materials would be used?
We just knew it was an ongoing job. We didn't know exactly what was going to be used, no.
Yeah. And then if we can turn up page 5 of your first witness statement, OSB 6087, page 5, and you say, this is under paragraph 3, in the last line of that first paragraph, you say this: Osborne Berry was one of the 3 preferred teams Harley instructed. Osborne Berry submitted a competitive tender which was accepted by Harley. Do you see that there?
I do.
Now, do you mean that there was a competitive tender for the Grenfell project, or are you talking about a tender more generally to Harley to be one of its preferred installation companies?
I presume we put a tender in and Harley would choose which one was the most viable one to use. But I know other people tendered for that job.
Yeah. And that's a tender specific to the Grenfell Tower project,
Specific
was it?
to the Grenfell Tower project.
Yeah. And when you say you know other people tendered for that job, how do you know that?
Only from hearsay.
Right. From talking to other contractors at the time?
Correct.
Yeah. Now, if we can turn up OSB 7061. This is an email. If we zoom in at the top email, this is an email from Rob Maxwell of Harley to Osborne Berry, and it's dated the 24th of September 2014, and it says, Bez, use this to price the project. Kind regards, Rob Maxwell. Do you see that there?
I do.
Did you see that email at the time? Can you recall?
I didn't.
You didn't? So was it Mr. Berry dealing with this at this stage?
Mr. Berry was dealing with this at this stage.
Does he always deal with the initial
He deals with
contract
the
scope and the price?
He deals with the paperwork side of it because that's not my best
see.
quality, I'm afraid.
Okay, that's helpful. What we see is at the very bottom of page 3, what was attached to this email in the very first bullet point there, this E3317 cost summary, was a Grenfell Tower schedule of quantities. Now, I'll show it you in a minute, but can you recall whether you saw that document
I
at the time?
saw the bill of quants, yes.
Yeah, you saw that. Now, between the first inquiry about the project in August 2014 and Mr. Berry's receipt of this email on the 24th of September 2014, can you recall whether you had any other conversations around this time with Harley about the proposed work at Grenfell Tower?
I can't remember any now.
Yeah. So let's just turn up the cost summary. So it's OSB 51, sorry. OSB 7051. Sorry, is there? Yes. So is this what you were just referring to as the bill of quants, the bill of quantities?
That's the bill of quants, yes.
Yeah. And I think what we see in this document is they've broken down the elements of the work and the particular products that would be installed on the rain screen system and given you just the quantities
Yes.
involved. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And is that how you would normally end up pricing for a job, by seeing a document like this?
Exactly. Because somebody's already bought this to this stage. For us to actually go back through the drawings and work all this out ourselves would take so long,
Yeah,
the job would be delayed
yeah,
considerably.
yeah. So this shortcuts that and just tells you the quantities.
Correct.
And is this, therefore, what you understood that you would be installing?
That is, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then, just following this story through, if we go to OSB 7046, this is then an email from Bez, that's Mr. Berry, to Mr. Maxwell of Harley of the 29th of September 2014. And it says, we can see at the top there, price for job, £252,465. Do you see that there?
I do.
And then he says, any problems, give me a ring and let me know ASAP if price is okay to carry on working. Thanks, Bez. Do you see that there?
I do.
So we can see here that Mr. Berry is providing a lump sum for the job. Do you know how that price was calculated?
On square meterage.
Right.
Per item on that.
I see.
quantity.
So you look at the material.
Yeah. And you know.
What, you have an understanding of the complexity of installing that material, do you?
Yes.
And then so you have a standard price per
X
metre
amount
square.
per meterage. Yes.
I see, that you apply to that. Were you involved in assisting with the calculation of the price for the job?
Oh yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So what would your involvement comprise?
Basically, sit down and talk to Graham.
Yeah.
How long we thought it would take, how much work would be involved, go through the meterage prices, and then just put the prices down on the quantities, basically.
Yeah. And you've said there how long we thought it would take. So does that mean that you would be proposing back to Harley how long the job would take, as opposed to
No,
Harley saying
no,
to you,
no. How long we would think it would take to do that particular item, then we
I
would
see.
know how much labour we would need to actually complete that item, or the items.
I see. And would you have been told by this time the length of time the project was due to last?
I really cannot remember that.
Right, yeah,
I would probably say yes, but I wouldn't give you a guarantee.
yeah. And this price for the job here that we see, is that what you've described in your statement as the submission of a competitive tender for the work?
That is correct.
Yeah. Was there any other document which formed part of Osborne Berry's tender? For example, a method statement or other description of how you would go about the works?
Not at the time. We wouldn't receive method statements till we actually got onto site and got the job, basically.
Right, yeah,
And they would be site-specific to various tasks which are on the actual building.
yeah. I see. So you wouldn't have supplied Harley with any other information, for example, about who might be carrying out the works, the qualifications of those carrying it out, nothing like that, just
Not
the
at all.
price?
Just the price.
Okay. So I now just want to ask you some questions about the information that was provided to Osborne Berry prior to commencing the installation works. And if we can turn up page 5 of your second witness statement, that's OSB 6090, page 5. And at paragraph 7C, so that's the second item down on that page, you're asked the question, did the measurements taken by Osborne Berry correspond to the dimensions given on the plans drawings given to Osborne Berry by Harley? And you say this, Osborne Berry did not receive any initial plans. We were simply tasked to obtain measurements. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Can you just help us, where you say Osborne Berry did not receive any initial plans, what do you mean by that? What kind of initial plans might you have expected to receive?
I don't really know what plans I would have expected to see. All I remember seeing was actually pictures of the tower block on all elevations.
Yeah.
And positions where we were asked to measure from and to.
Yes.
To give dimensions back to Harley so they could manufacture the cladding and the windows to those positions.
I see. So were those, when you say pictures, were those elevation drawings? Or
Elevation drawings.
Yeah, so they weren't photographs, they were drawings.
No, they were drawings, yes.
And
But
Harley-
they didn't say what was going on the drawing. It was just an elevation drawing of the building.
Yeah. And Harley pinpointed you where they
Where
wanted you to
it
take some
measured.
measurements.
They wanted to know what the measurements were, and that's
Yeah,
what we
I
did.
understand. Did you ask for any specific documentation, drawings, plans, specifications relevant to the project before Osborne Berry started on site?
I would have thought so, yes.
Yeah.
I would have thought so.
But you can't help us as to whether, in fact, such documentation was received on this project?
I can't.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yes, and you talked for a moment there about being tasked to obtain measurements, and I think you're referring there to a process you describe in your second statement. This is paragraph 7, page 4. We don't need to turn it up, where early on you measured the gaps between windows, the width and height in comparison with the concrete structure, and also the centre lines of the columns. Is that right?
That is correct.
So you did that measurement exercise and discovered that some of the columns weren't plumb. Is that right?
That is correct.
Yeah. And then you passed that information back to Harley, so they had exact measurements on the tower. Is that right?
That is correct.
Yeah. And you say that that job of measuring took 2 days. Can you recall roughly when you carried out that work? We know you were first approached in August 2014 in relation to this project. Can you recall how long after that you would have done that measurement work?
I don't,
Okay.
to be truthful.
Now, sticking with the topic of drawings and information provided to you, if we can look at OSB 7027. This is a register of drawings. Don't worry, I'm going to go to a better version of this in a moment, but I just want to establish that this is a register of drawings. It's a Harley register of drawings, and it's been disclosed to the inquiry by Osborne Berry. Now, the quality of this is quite poor, so what we're going to do is take you to another better quality of it from Ryden's disclosure. So if we can bring up RYD 56337. Great, thank you. So this, we believe, is an identical document to the one from Osborne Berry's disclosure. Did you see this Harley drawing register during the time you worked on the project?
I cannot remember seeing it, no.
Would you normally expect to see a drawing register like this on such a project?
No, I would leave that to the likes of Rob Maxwell to deal with, and Ben Bailey, the actual drawing register, to make sure they all came, and they then would hand them over to us.
I see. And how would they hand them over to you? What was the process for that?
As the drawings were updated, revision A, revision B, revision C,
Yeah.
they would tell you to remove revision A,
Yeah.
as revision B has taken over.
And where would you actually be removing these from and replacing these? Did you have them in hard copy or electronically?
In hard copy.
In hard copy. And where were they physically?
They were stored in our container where we kept all our materials and all our tools.
So what, you had a site cabin on the site?
We had a container on site, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you would keep copies of the drawings in that container, is that right?
Correct.
For all your operatives to see, or just you and Mr. Berry?
Whoever needed to look at it was able to look at it.
I see. And so you expected that if there was a revision to a drawing, that you would be brought the replacement?
We'd be bought the replacement, the old one would be destroyed.
Yeah. And were you yourself actually involved in that process on the Grenfell project?
I did. I destroyed quite a lot of drawings, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And would you have looked at any of those drawings before you got to site, or would you look at them basically on the first day on site?
On the first day on site.
Yeah. And then if we just pick up on the same theme, looking at Mr. Berry's witness statement to the police that he's provided. This is MET 3019985. This is a statement of Mr. Berry to the Met Police. It's dated, we can see there in that box at the top, it's dated the 21st of August 2017. And I just want to pick it up at the bottom of this page 1 and on to page 2. So this is where he's describing that measurement process that we were just discussing a moment ago. And he says, 4 lines up, the measurements were done by tape measure. Mark and Rob stayed doing this for around a week. Is that you, Mark?
That's
Osborne?
correct. Yeah.
And Rob Maxwell, is that?
No, that would be Rob Thomas. That's another one of our lead fitters.
Thank you. And then all the measurements were passed back to Harley. And then you say this Mr. Berry says this. Around September, October 2014, Mark and Chris Beater attended the tower to drill preparatory holes in the building using handheld drills. And then if we go over to the top of the next page, it says this was for the windows and cladding to be fitted the entire height of the tower. These were based on the plans that had been delivered to the site and were not done by ourselves. Do you see that there?
I do.
So when he's describing the plans that have been delivered to the site, is it your evidence that what he's describing there is what we were just referring to?
Off that drawing register, yes.
Yeah, so it's the drawing register and it's held in the unit
Yeah.
that Osborne Berry have at site.
Yes. Yes.
And was Osborne Berry given sufficient opportunity to review setting out drawings before commencing any of its preparatory work on site?
When I levelled the building up, I left marks on the building so that we could always refer back to those marks, knowing full well what they meant.
Yeah,
And we just followed those marks back to the drawings that had been prepared by Harley and
I
worked
see.
back off those.
I see. Yeah. Did Osborne Berry ever have any input into the preparation or finalisation of any of the Harley drawings, including the detailed drawings for example, the fixings on the project?
None whatsoever.
None whatsoever. And did Osborne Berry ever produce any drawings or plans itself
No.
during the course of its work?
No.
So you were
None of-
always working off the Harley
Always
drawings?
working off Harley drawings.
Thank you. Now, if we can turn to RYD 30888923. These are minutes of a meeting. It's a subcontractor progress meeting. And we can see there in the top left, it's dated the 28th of April 2015. And we can see that you're present at the meeting. Do you see the list of attendees present? We've got Simon O'Connor from Ryden, other Ryden operatives, Ben Bailey of Harley, and then you for Osborne Berry. And if we look on page 2 of these minutes at item 6.02, yes, there we've got, it says BB, so I think that's Ben Bailey, to provide elevation drawings showing progress on a weekly basis to DO, and we think that must be Daniel Osgood of Ryden.
I would assume so.
And then the item below that, 6.03, it says BB, so Ben Bailey, to issue elevations showing positions of all fire break on all elevations to DO. That's Daniel Osgood. Now, we're going to come back to discuss in detail fire breaks and cavity barriers. But just in terms of the information you were provided with, do you know whether Mr. Bailey or Mr. Osgood ever showed you elevation drawings of the tower showing the positioning of the fire breaks?
I had a drawing of the tower
Yeah.
where the fire breaks were marked in red pen to confirm where they had to go
Yeah.
to make sure the compartmentalising of the building was complete, basically.
Yes. And you say you had a drawing and it was in red pen showing where the...
Identifying what areas they're going to be put in.
So had somebody with a pen physically annotated
Yes,
on that drawing?
Yes.
So the red pen...
was for fire breaks.
Yeah, and the red pen was not there originally on the drawing. It was something that somebody put on the
Afterwards.
drawing.
Afterwards, as far as I can remember.
Yes?
Yes.
And do you know who put that red pen on the drawing?
I do not.
You don't?
No, I was just provided with the drawing.
So does that mean that you didn't actually ever see elevation drawings with the cavity barriers shown on the elevation in drawing form?
I probably did, to be honest, most definitely.
But is your evidence that what you were working off on a day-to-day basis, that you were working off the one with the red pen?
Working off the one with the red pen, and then before that we did it because of we had a problem where the fire break went in respect to we had to put an EPDM to seal the angle brackets
Yes.
to stop water leaking down and into the flats.
Yes.
You couldn't penetrate the EPDM
Yes.
with the fire break or the insulation, so the EPDM was put on and then the fire break was moved upwards to allow fitting of the fire break and fitting of the insulation.
And when you say the fire break was moved upwards to allow the fitting of the fire break and fitting of the insulation, do you mean, is this on the columns we're talking about?
No, this is on the horizontal.
Yeah,
So we did a sample panel for everybody to come and look at,
yeah.
and then they agreed that was they were happy with that, and that's where we proceeded from there. So that's where the fire breaks were set up from, basically.
Does that mean that the positioning of the horizontal cavity barriers on the tower was slightly higher, rose up
Yes.
from the position that had originally been
Originally
shown
on
in the
the
Harley
drawing.
drawings?
Yes.
That's really helpful, because I was going to take you, and I'll still take you to it, to a
No.
photograph where we think we see cavity barriers higher than in the drawings.
Yes.
And you're confirming that that was a specific change that was agreed on site?
Yes.
And who did you have those discussions with about raising up the cavity barrier?
It was either Kevin Lamb or Daniel Atkins-Jones.
And can you recall roughly when? I mean, how far through the project?
No, early on in the project. Then a sample panel was completed. I believe I was on the mast climber at the time, Graham was on the mast climber, and several other people, probably 8 or 10 people, all came up to have a look at what we had done. And then that was agreed that that's where it would be, and that's where we worked from, basically.
Yeah. And can you help me with this? Can you recall roughly by how much you raised that cavity barrier?
Not a great deal. Measurement-wise, I can't tell you, but it wasn't a great deal. It was just enough to get a fixing in so that we could hold the insulation in place on the wall without perforating the barrier below it.
Could it have gone up by as much as a foot?
I wouldn't have thought so.
No?
I would have thought more like 100 mil.
100 mil?
Yeah,
So 10 centimetres?
yeah, yeah.
And approximately how far from the head of the window was that cavity barrier then,
God,
roughly?
I really can't remember.
Okay. I'm going to come to some photographs which might
Yeah, that's
help us
fine.
with this
That's
in a bit. Now, looking at page 6 of your second witness statement, if we can go to that OSB 6090 at page 6, paragraph 9A, in the top half of the page. So the inquiry's asked there whether Harley provided Osborne Berry with a method statement for the installation work, who provided it, when was it provided, etc. And you've said there you cannot remember. Does that remain your evidence that you can't remember whether there was a method statement?
I had various method statements for various parts of the work.
Yeah.
Basically, I can't remember if it was just for insulation or cladding but there
I see.
was method statements going around.
Yeah. Well, let's try and help with that.
Ben provided those.
That's Ben Bailey of
Ben
Harley.
Bailey of Harley.
Thank you. Yeah, let's try and help with that. Let's look at HAR 30100913. So this is a method statement. It's a Harley method statement. And the activity it's dealing with is specified at the top there. It says installation of cladding system. And we can see at the very bottom of page 1 that this appears to have been issued on the 5th of January 2015. Can you see the date there at the bottom? And you're listed at the top of that page as the site foreman. We see that there, Mark Osborne.
Right, yes.
And Ben Bailey is there as the site supervisor. Now, does this help as to whether you saw method statements like this on the project?
I don't remember that particular method statement now,
Okay,
but I did see method statements telling me how things should be fitted.
okay. If we could go on at page 2, there's a section headed sequence. At the bottom half of that page, or bottom third of that page, can you see there's a small subheading underlined sequence?
I do.
And what we get is a number of stages that are numbered in this method statement that seem to be the step-by-step stages to be followed in terms of installing the cladding. From putting in supporting timber frame, brackets to setting out, the drilling of holes, item 2, timbers installed on the centre lines, etc., item 3. And then if we keep going over the page to page 3, and we look at the top of that, then we've got 5, the different colour panels then lifted and by a scaffold by 2 operatives and held in place. Now, just looking at that sequence, can you help us as to whether the actual method of fixing the cladding did comply with that sequence?
Not at all. For one, there's no timber runners on the building,
Yeah.
and for 2, the panels were fitted way down the line compared to when the insulation and firebreak was fitted.
Do you mean that there was a big time gap between when the
Most definitely.
insulation was fitted and the cavity barriers were fitted, and then a break to then when the cladding panels were fitted?
Correct.
Yeah. Let's turn to another of these method statements. This is RYD 3044095. And if we look at this method statement, it's another Harley method statement, and the activity here is said to be installing column cladding, as opposed to the activity previously was, let me just remind myself. Yes, previously the activity was installation of cladding system. This one seems to be more specific. It says installing column cladding. Can you help us as to whether you saw this method statement, just to help? It's actually dated a bit later. It's the 22nd of June 2015. We see that on the bottom left of this. If we can just check the date, the bottom left of this method statement.
I've got that.
Yeah. And I think you just said you do recall seeing this one. Is that right?
I do.
Again, you're listed as the site foreman there. And if we turn to page 2, under the heading sequence at the bottom of that page, we get a different numbered list. It's a numbered list that's much longer. It goes onto the next page. I can show you that in a moment. And we can see again, stage by stage, what should happen in terms of the sequence of the column cladding. Loading the mast climber with the rails and brackets, raising the mast climber to working level, inserting bolts, then lowering the mast climber at 3, using the setting out, and raising the lower cladding channel to a correct level. Number 5, installing 2 pairs of brackets onto the pre-installed fixing studs. 6, repeating this process up the building until the top floor is reached. And then if we go over the page, once the rails have been installed, this is item 7, operatives travel down the building and install the intermediate brackets. Then 8, operatives will then remove the bottom M10 dead fixing. And then 9, when all the brackets have been installed on the cladding rails, operatives will install the vertical fire breaks in the same position as the internal party walls, making sure that the joints are buttered tightly together and the joints taped with adhesive-backed foil Nort tape. And then at 10, After that, operatives will then fit the 100mm thick insulation around the brackets and fire breaks, taping joints with a Class 0 adhesive foil tape where necessary. And then when the cladding channels, fire breaks and insulation have been fitted, operatives will install the hook-on panels and secure with a hidden self-drilling screw.
That is correct.
You see that there?
That is
Now, I've taken you through that slowly because we just want to check, was that the method that you actually followed on site for installing the column cladding?
The column cladding, yes, but there were pieces left out of it for the tie legs of the mast climbers,
Yeah,
because Rydens in their infancy decided to put the mast climber legs onto the columns, not onto the flat panels.
right.
So that one or two of these would have been left out going up the building wherever a mast climber leg
Yeah.
attached to the building.
So you had
basically,
gaps that you had to then go back
and refill
and
later.
refill. And were you going back to fill those gaps when all the rest of it had got to the final stage?
Correct.
Right.
And the mast climbers were being struck to come down the building, basically. So the mast climbers would be loose when you were actually fitting those panels.
I see. So for those areas, you did it all in one go, did you?
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you. That's helpful. And can you recall, you say you think you saw this method statement. Would you have been provided that in hard copy or electronically?
I would presume, knowing me, it would be in hard copy.
Yeah.
But
and again,
yes,
would
I
that
do
be in-
remember this one. This is one of Ben's, definitely.
Yeah. And would that be kept in your site
In
cabin?
my side cabin, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Was any part of the installation process left to Osborne Berry to determine in practice?
No,
No.
no, not at all.
It was all strictly regulated by Harley instructions, was it?
Yes.
And was any part of it, in fact, undertaken based on past experience of other sites? Did you have experience of fitting these panels or fire breaks or the insulation on other sites? And did any of that knowledge that you'd acquired on other projects directly carry through to how you did it on this project?
I would think it did, yes.
Yeah. But can you think of any specific examples of where you might have done something different to what perhaps Harley instructed you to do because you'd had previous experience of fitting something?
Not off the top of my head, no.
Okay. Now, in your first witness statement, this is at page 3, paragraph 4K, we don't need to turn it up, you say that Osborne Berry simply installed the materials as directed, and you say something similar in your second statement at page 6, paragraph 9B, you say that the sequence of work was dictated by Harley. Can you just help us when you're using the word directed and dictated, precisely what you mean by that?
We were told what part of the building needed to be done at what particular time.
Yeah.
I would say probably Harley got that information from Rydens, the main contractor,
Yeah.
because they didn't want you on this elevation today because they were doing something else, and we were moved round the elevations in that respect, basically.
Yeah. So in practice, it was always up to Harley where you were working and how you were working.
Correct.
Yeah. Were you ever provided with any additional instructions on site for how the cladding was fitted, beyond those contained in the drawings and the method statements?
No.
I think you might have just referred to perhaps one example of that, which is raising the cavity barriers, the horizontal cavity barriers. Would you agree that that wasn't something that was instructed in the drawing?
No, that's my fault, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that wasn't in a drawing or a method statement, it was agreed on site, was it?
That's correct. That's correct.
Are there any other examples you can think of like that, of in practice when you got to try and fit the cladding, something needed to change from what was shown in the drawings?
Fixing the cladding rails back to the top bracket, it was meant to be fixed with a 10mm deadbolt, but it would have been impossible to get at the deadbolt because the deadbolt would have been buried behind the insulation.
Right.
So it was brought up that it could be fixed with tech screws, which are
Yeah.
self-drilling, self-threading screws.
Yeah.
And that was brought up and passed back to Daniel Atkins-Jones for approval, basically.
Yeah.
And that came back as being approved.
Yeah. And when you say...
Sorry to interrupt.
No, go.
There was probably various other little things, but remembering them
Yeah.
is very difficult
No, I
far down
understand.
the line.
And when you say that was passed back to Daniel Anketell-Jones, would you actually speak to Daniel Anketell-Jones about something like that, or was it done by email?
I would have spoke to him about that.
You would have spoke to him?
Yeah.
And just picked up the phone and given him a call?
Just give him a ring, yeah.
Yeah. And again, when the cavity barriers were slightly raised, I think you said before that would have been discussed with either Kevin Lamb or Daniel Anketell-Jones.
That would be neither of those. If Kevin was on site, I would have discussed it with him when he was on site.
Yeah.
If he wasn't, I would have discussed it over the phone with Daniel.
Yeah, okay. That's helpful. Mr. Chairman, I'm about to move to a different topic, so I think that might be a good moment
good point then.
for the lunch break. Thank you.
Yes, okay. Mr. Osborne, we're going to have a break now so we can all get some lunch. We'll resume at 2 o'clock, please.
That's fine.
And while you're out of the room, I have to ask you, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything to do with it.
That's fine. No
All
problem.
right, thank you. I'd like to go to the usher then, please. All right, 2 o'clock then, please.
Thanks.
Thank you.